For the longest time in World of Warcraft, raiding has been a huge part of the game. The research that goes into your class, preparing your gems, your enchants, looking up your bis, learning your rotation, and of course checking out boss mechanics so you aren't the guy who doesn't understand why they've wiped the raid 4 times in a row. A lot of effort goes into raiding from a lot of people. But for one version of World of Warcraft, the raids themselves were, not the most challenging, shall we say. In fact, looking back now, we can see the bosses were more or less different sized target dummies that distributed nice purple items. But the tough bit wasn't taking on the bosses necessarily, it was getting to the raid in one piece. This is why Classic Vanilla was the game where getting into the raid alive was harder than the actual raids themselves. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Bloodline Heroes of Lithos. Bloodline Heroes of Lithos is a free-to-play high fantasy hero collection RPG available on mobile devices, which has a big twist on traditional collection games. They've also hooked me up with an amazing starter pack that you can grab when you download the game for free. Bloodlines has visually impressive, realistic 3D graphics and a world where you build up your kingdom and form a legacy according to the traits that you value the most. There is unique gacha gameplay through a hybrid trait system, meaning you have influence over what you want in your kingdom. You can combine together the traits from the likes of orcs, demons, vampires, elves, and so many more to create over 800 different fantasy hybrids, which not only inherit their traits and talents, but combine their appearances too. New for 2023 is the Guild Wars system, where you set out to conquer new territories with your guild for amazing rewards, such as the most unique hybrids known as Bloodcraft Legends. New bloodlines and combinations are constantly being released for the game, giving endless possibilities for your legacy. You can download the game for free on both Android or iOS, or via scanning their QR code on screen. Get yourself a special starter pack worth $20 using my link, which will contain 1 summoning crystal, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds. Also, for the next 7 days, the first 20 players who leave their in-game account ID and username below the pinned comment will receive a free legendary champion, Onyxia, who will give you that extra head start. Many thanks to Bloodlines Heroes of Lithos for the sponsor today. Back to WoW. Now, in any other WoW expansion ever, it really doesn't matter if you have a little mishap with gravity on the way to the raid or get in some PvP, other than your raid leader asking what you're doing, of course, because at the end of the day, you get there, you buff up, you eat up, you flask up, and you're good to go. What happened 5 minutes ago isn't going to affect your entire raid night performance. In Vanilla Classic, this was not the case. In fact, ensuring you did get to raid alive was absolutely critical to your performance. Imagine this being the case in any other expansion. There were no flying mounts, and if you died for any reason on your way to raid, literally any reason at all, you don't get heroism and bloodlust for the whole evening. This is kind of similar to how it was back then. And you better believe there were people who, on each and every server, made it their life's work to ensure that getting to raid alive was going to be as hard as possible. Why was dying such a big deal then? It's pretty simple. There were these things called world buffs. I go over them all in this video and the lengths you had to go to collect them all. More or less though, you had to travel around the whole of Azeroth gathering these buffs from various, often open world, sources. They would give massive boosts to your performance, such as Songflower Serenade giving 5% extra crit chance and some more stats, or Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer for 10% spell crit, 5% physical crit, and a nice chunk of attack power too. There were a bunch more of them as well, and they all stacked, meaning a player who had put effort into their buffs pre-raid was, depending on your class, upwards of 40% more powerful than they would have been without these buffs. In terms of DPS, healing, or even bonus health for tanking, world buffs were a very big deal. They also put a gigantic target on your back saying, hey, I've just spent a bunch of my time collecting these buffs. It sure would be a shame if I were to die and lose them all before I can get into raid. It was very much like a game of cat and mouse, the guys collecting buffs trying to hide away and stay out of sight, and the hunters looking out for players with the buffs just to take them away so they didn't do as well in raid that evening. Oh, and some of the world buffs were magical effects too, so you didn't even have to die to lose them. You could have a level 20 something priest or whatever level it is you learn Dispel Magic run up to you, spamming that ability, and you lose a buff that could have increased your crit by 5%. which of course meant you needed to load upon trash buffs to protect the good ones. Even though Dispel Magic was random, of course, you could still get unlucky. For example, as a Warlock, I had Water Breathing, Detect Invisibility, Shadow Ward, Demon Armor, and then you can load upon cheap combat scrolls. Oh, and one more thing worth mentioning, obviously this was only really a problem on PvP servers. On PvE servers, you kinda just go and get your buffs whenever, and then you run into raid, solo, whenever. But let me tell you, I played on a PvP server for the majority of Classic, and I would never even dream of attempting to get into a raid by myself. I might as well have just taken my world buffs and thrown them down the drain, because the team effort in Classic for raiding didn't start when the raid began, it started a good while before that. Getting into raid clean was a guild and raid-wide effort, and the more populated your server, or the more skewed faction-wise your server was, the harder that objective became. So, you're level 60, you've been farming your consumes, your prebis, raid night is finally here. You've gone and collected all your world buffs, and it's now time to put all that preparation to the test. It's time to raid, which means it's time to get into Molten Core. Located at the bottom of Blackrock Mountain, this is the first big target to get into alive, and we do have several options to get in and several factors that are going to make this tough to do. On the positive side, there are two separate entrances into Blackrock Mountain from the north or the south, meaning your raid can fly to Searing Gorge or Burning Steps and then run over. Your raid also has the choice of doing the lava jump all the way down from the northern entrance. This is fast, but often a little bit more risky. People can mess up the jump, and you don't always know who is going to be waiting down at the bottom for you once you're in the lava. The other choice is following the huge chain all the way down. This one is done way less, but if you know there's a raid group at the bottom, you can position much better against them instead of throwing yourself into lava where you can be slowed and rooted. What makes this raid hard to get to is that either entrance into the mountain is a narrow corridor, and whilst you do kind of all have to run in together, narrow corridors can very much be death traps. It takes one mage to catch your raid off guard via invisibility potions and trinketing into a Frostnova and Sapper to lead to a chain of events. We can lose half your raid. 3 or 4 mages could legitimately wipe out a stacked raid of 40 people in about 2 or 3 globals. Mages were pretty good back then. Also inside Blackrock Mountain, you cannot mount back in vanilla, so it's not only that we don't have flying mounts, you just don't have any mounts at all here, and trying to run ahead with speed boost or sprint isn't going to do you much good either. It's just going to get you caught out of position a lot sooner. It's worth bringing up that there is counterplay to getting engaged on there, which was super important that you prepare in advance too, and organize when you're going to be using them. First up, we have free action potions, or more commonly abbreviated to FAPs, as we like to call them. These, when combined with other items, ensured that any class in the game could be CC immune and have a mini sprint effect too. FAP into Nifty was a big call out to push forwards for your raid. After that, it's just hoping you have the numbers over the other people, and usually more mages that tends to help, which as an organised 40-man raid, you tended to do. If you were particularly worried about getting AoE down, you could also pre-pop various protection potions such as Fire, Arcane, and so on. There was something for all the various elements. These all lasted 1 hour in Classic for some reason, and they stacked. You could log in, pop a potion, log out for the 2-minute cooldown timer, relog, and do it again to ensure you had all the protection against all schools of magic. There were also limited invulnerability potions, or lips, which were really powerful. These are what mages would use when they blink into groups aggressively to Nova, and would protect you from all physical attacks for a short duration. On top of that, you could still act, cast, and melee whilst under this effect. You also may think, would everybody be carrying a PvP trinket? Well, you would if you could, but in early Classic, the PvP trinket didn't exist yet. It released alongside Blackwing Lair in Phase 2 when the honor and ranking system dropped, so you had to look for other options. For Blackrock Mountain, scouting was key, and a lot of people had second accounts in Classic for summoners or to play the opposite factions on PvP servers and so on. So it tended to be the case where you had people hidden somewhere in the mountain, or rogues that were stealthed, scouting and calling out enemy positions. Very thematic RPG stuff, to be honest. It's also worth mentioning we had layering. It was a little more rudimentary back then, but you could force swap layers onto a different one to avoid raid-wide PvP encounters teleporters. Kinda lame, but a lot of people opted into doing that. The northern entrance was most used for Molten Core in my experience, as the short drop into the lava left you right next to the door, meaning it was easy to fap and get inside before you had any problems. Also, the window next to the NPC that teleports you into Molten Core is actually a portal into the instance. It's not really clearly marked out, but it is. So if you dropped off the ledge angle from the upper pathway correctly, or swam beneath it, you would get teleported inside. This was a really safe play to make and was probably the best way to get inside the instance, since if people wanted to chase you, they had to follow you into the lava, and their choice would be to swim around the side to escape or go in the instance themselves. But eventually we had Blackwing Lair release, also inside Blackrock Mountain. The entrance, once you've completed the achievement that is, was an orb at the far end of the hallway where the instance to the portal to Blackrock Spire is located. This one could be even more problematic to get to than Molten Core, simply because the routes you had to take were, you guessed it, narrow corridors. There were, however, two main ways to get up there as well, either the entrance on the eastern side of the mountain or up from the chain on the northern side of the mountain. You could also hop inside Blackrock Spire if you got separated from your group and try to rejoin later. I saved my buffs several times doing this. Oh, and in case you're wondering why not just summon people, you couldn't do that in Classic because, I don't know, you couldn't. Your locks would have to go outside if they wanted to summon you. Also, each summon costs 1 soul shard. Once you got inside the main hallway where the orb was, unleashing your FAP and Nifty and just rushing whoever was at the end nearly always won the battle on a pure numbers basis. Once you get stuck in Mage AoE, you just kinda win very fast. That was as long as there wasn't so many of you piled on top of the orb that it was impossible to click. You know how there was a portal next to Molten Core as an option to get inside? I don't know why they didn't do that again here. Release night of Blackwing Lair was a total disaster back when I was playing on Gehennas. Turns out clicking a small orb to teleport inside is kinda hard when there's about 100 people on top of it, and that's without going over the fact that Blackrock Mountain, with over 1,000 people in it, kinda just didn't work. Phase 1 also had Onyxia too, of course, though if I'm honest, you tended to do this one at the end of the raid night, where buffs had already timed out by themselves, or maybe people had died with them. Also, actually trying to DPS on this fight could be a grief since Onyxia messes with threat all the time. I swear I spent half my Onyxia fight sitting at the back and wanding, because I didn't want my Shadow Bolt to crit and instantly shoot me up to near the top of threat. The true classic Warlock experience. Anyways, getting in here could be a bit of a pain, mainly because the res run on both factions put you miles away from the entrance, meaning you get a nice few minutes on the way back to enjoy the scenery. Thanks for that, Blizz. I also want to do a quick mention for Zul'Gurub as well. Throughout my entire time playing on a PvP server, I never even once went to Zul'Gurub the intended way. I guess it was in part to keep buffs, but even if I didn't have buffs, I ended up still using this route. You see, back then, Alliance didn't have a flight path in northern Stranglethorn Vale. The closest flight path to ZG was either Duskwood or Westfall, which are, well, not very close, are they? But there was another way, which was A, much faster, and B, much safer. And this was through some creative use of game mechanics in Duskwood. I went and tried to see if this skip still works in Wrath, and yep, can confirm that it does, after quite a bit of remembering how it works, that is. This gets you into an unloaded version of Zul'Gurub that still exists in the open world, but doesn't have all the elites and enemies in it, meaning you can run over from where Jindo the Hexer usually is, straight through the instance portal and then be inside the raid. Even with me failing the jump for about 2 minutes when practicing, I still think this would be faster than the alternatives for Alliance. But in time, the next major raid tier would release. After the war effort had been completed and the Scepter of the Shifting Sands assembled, AQ40 officially opened. Now, whilst Blackrock Mountain had its issues with the narrow corridors and no mounts, AQ40 presented its own set of problems. The primary one was that it was located in the absolute middle of nowhere, as far south as you could possibly get in Silithus. Now, in comparison, Blackrock Mountain for Alliance was right next to Stormwind, so you could just fly to a zone nearby, and Horde could set their half to Kargath and go for a short ride. No one really had an easy time getting to AQ. You could set your Hearth in Cenarian hold, and running was definitely an option. The problem was world buffs, surprisingly. All that time running was time lost on your buffs, and whilst you kinda had to run into Blackrock Mountain, AQ40 had more options. There were two main problems to overcome. First, the main gateway that was open during the war effort, which created a natural choke point, and the second was the stairs leading up to the raid on the left-hand side. It was a one-way uphill battle with several pillars where people could be hiding behind, and in my experience there were always people waiting outside, either looking for PvP, waiting for their raid, or just having gotten used to being the majority faction on the server. This led to players finding creative spots around the entrance, and trust me, there were a lot of them. Whether it was jumping out of bounds and then climbing around a wall, or finding a way to get stuck inside a wall, people did anything to create a spot where they could summon their raid team safely. I've seen entire 40-man raids just randomly run out of a wall next to the entrance of AQ40 before. During Classic, the spot I was most familiar with was just up the ledge towards where the big bend in the stairs is. In fact, it was often the case that more than one guild would be summoning at the same time, so you would all join forces as 80 or 120 people and rush the gates of AQ. Most of the time it worked, sometimes you got left behind, but that was one of the best options for getting into the raid alive. The final big tier of Classic was of course Naxxramas, where world buffs were more important than ever. Having a full set of buffs could be the difference between a clean kill and the beginning of a wipe fiesta. Similar to AQ40, Nax was kind of in the middle of nowhere again. Flight locations weren't too bad from Undercity or Ironforge, but Light's Hope Chapel as the nearest flight point was still a good ride away from the raid. On the upside, the benefits Nax had was the area around it was incredibly open, more so than any raid tier beforehand, which created a number of approaches which guilds could take. In fact, you could even get in solo relatively safely with invisibility potions. The problem was, again, your world buffs are ticking down. Each second you're playing safe is a second off your buff timers. So much like AQ40, people resorted to finding safe summoning spots instead, and whilst there were no walls to hide in next to the entrance, there were mushrooms. And these mushrooms, through a bit of experimentation and slow falling, could be climbed on top of. I went on RAF servers to see if I could recreate one of the summoning spots, and I managed to get it, though Nax 40 isn't there anymore of course. Kel'Thuzad flew it on over to Northrend or something, but it used to be just below the shroom. This was a relatively safe space to summon your raid, and then have everyone bring Noggin Foggers to proc the slow fall effect, or have some other way to avoid fall damage while getting into the raid itself. Or alternatively, you could get below the Naxxramas entrance portal too. This was done through clipping the walls via changing your model size to something smaller, like with the winter event that turned your character into a gnome, and Nax released in winter fortunately enough, and then using blind or fear that would cause your character to path unpredictably, sometimes even through the floor. You could then get summoned there and just jump up to get through the portal. Pretty nifty. I'm sure there are plenty more safe spots and tactics people use for going into raids during Classic. The lengths people went to save their world buffs were pretty big, and if I'm being honest, some of the best times I had on Classic playing a PvP server was actually just going to raid, not the raid itself. The moment when you're rolling out as a group of 40 players, knowing full well you could come under attack by another huge group at any moment. There was a risk present as well, your buffs, and a meaningful risk at that. This is what made it memorable as opposed to regular world PvP where there's practically no risk. Sometimes you just get sent to the graveyard and you run back. You die with world buffs, your performance for the entire raid is rip before you even step foot inside. Yet, as cool as it sounds with the huge scale PvP, the rogue scouting, the safe spotting, it got old eventually. Well, for me it did. I ended up transferring off of a PvP server to PvE towards the end of Classic, for the simple reason that I got tired of playing cat and mouse every single raid night. It had been over 1 year of playing super careful and trying to keep my buffs. With Naxxramas coming out, I decided this is it. This is the final tier of Classic. I don't want to have to deal with this anymore. I want to be able to perform as well as I can without all the messing about getting into the raid. After the transfer, I will say it felt a bit weird just being able to run up to a raid and go inside, as if something was missing. But looking back, getting into the raid and PvP servers certainly had their upsides and their downsides. I guess that's what makes them memorable. I think what I can say for sure is there comes a point in games when most people want to experience the content for themselves and not be the content for other players. Giving someone else direct impact over your actions in a gaming world where it's been designed to be played for fun and in your free time is an inherently risky thing. So as fun as the getting to raid experience was at the beginning, let me just just end with this. The mice would never ask for there to be more cats, but the cats will always very loudly protest the opposite. Let me know your experiences with PvP servers and going to raid. Do you miss it all? Are you glad it's behind us? Drop it down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I'll see you all in the next one very soon.